Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is part 4 of The Curse of Palmyra. This episode deals with the theft of the sea wind, the two trials for the theft of the sea wind. So, if you haven't watched part 1 through 3, just push the pause button and get back with us. We'll be here. Okay, so let's get into it. First order of business is the copyright disclaimer. Second order of business is this is just my opinion. This video is my opinion. Opinions are not facts. And the viewer is always encouraged to do their own research to best form their opinions. Third order of business, I just want to make mention again that Stephanie Stearns was found not guilty for the murder of Eleanor Muff Graham. Now let's get started. Here's a picture of Mac and Muff Graham on the Sea Wind while it was stationed at Palmyra that fateful summer of 1974. Where we left off, Buck Walker was still on the run for 11 days. He dove into the water at the lagoon. The Coast Guard was coming for him. He got away. Stephanie was nabbed at the Ilokai, and allegedly she told FBI agent Cal Shishido that she and Alan loved the boat as much as the Grahams. So on November 7th, 1974, Muff's sister Kit Graham Muncie speaks with Stephanie Stearns at the Honolulu jail where she was still being held. And allegedly Stephanie tells Kit about the sharks on Palmyra, then of finding the Grahams' overturned Zodiac upside down, and that, she thought they drowned. And the sister then felt that Stephanie was holding something back. But later, Kit Muncie sees the newspapers with Stephanie wearing Muff's blouse, and I believe it's one of these pictures, and then she's absolutely chilled to the bone and then hates her. Here's a newspaper article. It says, talking with reporters at the pier side before departing for the private service, Miss Muncie said she spoke with Miss Stearns for about 5 minutes at the Halawa jail yesterday. However, she declined to tell about the conversation. Quote, it was a personal sort of thing. There's nothing to tell you. She was with them at the last, and I just wanted to talk to her. Quote, I think she was expecting me. She said she wanted to talk to me. Meanwhile, November 8th, 1974, Buck, real name Wesley Walker, going by Roy Allen, at this point using the alias Joe Evans, is on the run. So the U.S. DEA had a warrant out for Walker's arrest. They mentioned that he'd had a record of prior convictions. They described him as a bearded man with missing teeth and having tattoos. They heard that he had many friends. They were showing the pictures also of him dressed in the priest's outfit. The thing is, they didn't know he was now dressed as a tourist. This article reads that after he shivered for 3 hours under a pier, when he came out, he went to a clothing store, he bought a touristy aloha wear outfit, and checked into a Waikiki hotel where he shaved off his beard and cut his hair. Then he called a friend and asked him to find out what Stephanie was being charged with. That night, he watched the TV news report of Stephanie's arrest. The next day, he bought a plane ticket to the Big Island under the name J. Evans, and about 5 days later, he went to the tiny town of Hawaii on the northernmost point of Hawaii and checked into a hotel under the name of Joe Evans. A few days later, he's walking out of the restaurant and saw 2, quote, policemen of some kind sitting at a table near the door. So he quickly tries to leave and take off running. But halfway down the street, he stopped, turned around, and went to a park across the street from the restaurant. He sat down at a park table and spread out a newspaper in front of him. So sitting under a banyan tree across the street from Luke's Place restaurant in Kohala, he was nabbed. The Hawaii County policeman and FBI agent swooped in and they took him into custody. He was reading the paper and he did not resist arrest. A waitress at Luke's was interviewed and she said he was nice, kind of calm, just like any other guy. He said he was just looking the place over and said it was a nice place to come and stay. A hotel employee observed the arrest and said they just went across the street and arrested him when he was pointed out. There was no hassle. He was apparently reading a paper or something. Here's a picture of him. It's amazing to me. He is like one of those chameleon type guys who can really look different. Every picture of him looks different. I'm not saying he's Ted Bundy, but he has that Bundy chameleon look where he can look drastically different from picture to picture, day to day. And when he was questioned, Buck told the authorities, so his initial story to the authorities is that he last saw the Grahams on August 30th, and that Mac gave Buck an invite for Stephanie and Buck to come over for like a goodbye dinner, and the dinner was set for 6, and that the Grahams went fishing, and they're sitting there on the Seawind, and the Grahams didn't return, and that he and Stephanie hunted for them in the morning, and then they found the Zodiac overturned about 100 yards west of the Seawind. I think later on he says a half mile, so he later on adjusts that. And that they did not call for help using the radio on the Seawind because he claimed they did not know how to use a two-way radio. And he claimed they were going to, like their plan was to tow the Iola to Fanning Island using the Seawind, but that they hung the Iola up on Palmyra's reef and that they left the Iola there. And he claimed that they only painted the Seawind because it was rammed by a swordfish on its way to Hawaii. Make sense? Meanwhile, around November 8, 1974, Stephanie was represented by the attorney Winston Mirikitani. I think that's how you pronounce his last name, not sure. And she was maintaining that the Grahams had also invited them for dinner and then went missing. Stephanie Stearns allegedly told the FBI that she considered the Seawind a gift. Or at least it was printed something about the gift. Either she told the FBI that or it was in the paper. Either way, later her attorney, Winston Mirikitani, will try to assert that Stephanie Stearns' statement to the FBI was coerced, and he questioned as to when she was in custody. And this is a tactic. Well, it's a right for a defendant that you have to have your Miranda rights, correct? And there's also a question of when you're in custody, whether you feel free to leave, and what you say before you're in custody and what you say after you're in custody, right? So they were essentially trying to get those statements tossed, as you would, right? As you would, because they're not exactly what you want on the record, in my opinion. Meanwhile, on November 10th, 1974, there was a ceremony of aloha for Malcolm and Eleanor Muff Graham near Diamond Head with droppings of Vanda orchids and leis at sea. Because on this date, as of November 10th, no bodies were recovered. So truly you didn't know for sure the fate of the Grahams. So a dozen people were present on Pollux, Tempest. Bugliosi calls it the Journeyer. Bugliosi also changed names. Like he changed different folks' names. Like Stephanie Stearns becomes Jennifer Jenkins, and he changes some of the witnesses' names. So I don't know. The papers say the Tempest, so I'm going with the Tempest. Bugliosi calls it the Journey or whatever. Mary Muncie, that's Mac's sister. There was a minister, Ted Livingston, Freeman Lang, and all the old salts. They gathered together to have a ceremony of aloha. It says here the service, arranged by the Edwin R. Pollux, will be held about 3:30 p.m. off the Diamond Head buoy aboard the Pollux sailboat Tempest. The Pollux were friends of the Grahams and were at Palmyra at the same time last summer. Miss Catherine, that's Kit Muncie of Seattle, sister of Malcolm Graham, will be present. She has asked any who feel it's appropriate for them to attend the service to do so. Livingston said that he planned to mention in conclusion that, quote, the aloha God has for all mankind can even reach into the Hilo and Halawa jails. That's kind of nice. I mean, it can be shady, but it's kind of nice, too. It's like true. Aloha. I see you in the Hilo and Halawa jails, right? And her friend, Larry Siebert, then eventually visits Stephanie at the Halawa facility, and allegedly she denies the chess game story that she allegedly had originally told him. So we're going to get into how the friends kind of help get some evidence into the cases. So I believe it was on November 13th that Stephanie K. Stearns was released from the Halawa jail because she was bailed out with a $20,000 surety bond from her aunt, Momilani Abrams, who put up her own home as collateral. So Stephanie was in custody since Veterans Day, and then she was out on bail. Meanwhile, the federal grand jury came back with a 7-count indictment against Buck, Dwayne Walker, and Stephanie Stearns in regards to the theft of the Seawind. So they decided to use a grand jury, and this was a federal case because Palmyra was in federal territory. So let's look at the 7-count indictment. Essentially, the counts, to make it simple, are 1, theft of the Seawind, 2, theft of $400 in coins, and 3, theft of all the stuff on the Seawind. All right, all the treasures, all the goods, the merchandise on the Seawind. To those charges, the grand jury added counts: transportation of stolen property in excess of $5,000, 2, importing a pound of marijuana seeds, and also the grand jury charged Walker with separate counts: knowingly making a false statement on his passport application saying that his name is Roy Allen when in fact his true name is Buck Dwayne Walker, and 2, willfully failing to appear for sentencing in federal court here last September on a drug conviction. And we now all know that was the reason they left on the Iola to Palmyra, was because Buck was escaping a drug conviction, a sentencing for that. 3, they charged him with being a felon in possession of a firearm based on his past convictions involving drugs and armed robbery. Rifles and guns were found aboard the Seawind by federal agents. Around November 20th, 1974, the court refused to allow the couple, Stephanie and Buck, to confer. And Walker's attorney was complaining that the marshals were not allowing him to confer with Stephanie. And in my opinion, this is my opinion, that they wanted to get their story straight, and they weren't allowed any privacy until around December 9th, 1974. December 9th, Buck and Stephanie have a private conversation out of earshot of anyone else, and allegedly Buck winked at Stephanie at the end of the proceeding. So Buck is in court for the MDA charge, and John T. Miho, that's Buck's attorney at this time, he tells the prosecutor that Buck is willing to take a lie detector test and be examined by a psychiatrist because they were contending he may be mentally incompetent to stand trial. How Walker and the U.S. Attorney's Office were in quote-unquote negotiations, that Walker apparently wanted to take a lie detector test and there was a chance he might be given a psych exam. And John Miho, that was the court-appointed attorney for Walker, had said in that hearing that they were in negotiations with the federal government on a variety of things, but there was no agreement for him to plead to anything at that time, that Buck was open to take the lie detector test, but he declined to say what questions that Walker was willing to answer. And you know what? I believe that once he got those proposed questions, I think it was around January 1st of 1975, so they submitted to him, like, these are the questions that you will be asked. And Buck then promptly changed his mind on taking that lie detector test, citing then that, quote, he doesn't trust the FBI. So running up to Stephanie's trial, it was like November 15th, 1974. Her attorney at that time, Winston Mirikitani, asked the judge, who was Pence at that time, to issue a preliminary injunction against 2 different newspapers for just printing about the case. Because they said that the newspapers were implying murder when it was just a theft charge at that point. But Pence looked at it and found that the stories reporting the trial had been, quote, innocuous and mild, and that the reporting had been straight reporting. So running up to trial, you're going to have discovery, and you're going to have many times motions to suppress. And the defense tried many different avenues to get information suppressed. For example, Stephanie's attorney said that the authorities had tried to scare her to get a confession, that there was no probable cause on that, at the moment that she was on this boat. There was no probable cause on that date. And, they tried to get certain statements tossed out. One thing that runs up my backside that taints, in my opinion, everything about Stephanie is this motion. And you can say that maybe it was her attorney's idea or something, but they tried to do a salvage claim, to say salvage rights, claiming that Stephanie and Buck Walker risked their lives to save the Sea Wind after a swordfish pierced the hull during the perilous journey back to Hawaii. And so therefore, the Sea Wind was rightfully hers. The voyage to Hawaii was perilous and hazardous. Plaintiff and Walker rode out a storm at sea and fought sinking of the vessel Sea Wind when her hull was pierced by a swordfish. The voyage from Palmyra to Hawaii took approximately 34 days, she said. The rescue of the vessel was accomplished solely through the efforts of Plaintiff and Walker without the assistance from other craft. The Sea Wind, upon completion of her voyage, was hulled and painted, as is customary with seagoing vessels. The value of these services exceeds $30,000. For these reasons, she claimed the yacht and its cargo should be sold so that she and others may be properly compensated for their salvage efforts. This reads, the ruling came after a 3-hour hearing yesterday before U.S. District Court Gordon Thompson Jr. of San Diego, who rejected Ms. Stearns' request for a court order that the yacht and all its contents be turned over to her. Basically, it found that the government only has to return to her what she could prove belonged to her. And the defense had argued that there was no probable cause that a crime had occurred at that date, that they got her at the harbor, and therefore the yacht was hers. I mean, the absolute gall, right? And this article reads, you mean I don't even get my clothes? Queried suspected yacht thief Stephanie Stearns after hearing a federal judge order that she can take nothing but a portable emergency generator from the yacht, the Sea Wind. And the government replied, Miss Stearns already has her clothing. Yeah, I'm not going to rant. You heard what I have to say about that. Motion to suppress regarded a previous statement she had made under oath. Quote, she informed the court she had no alternative and had to take Mac's boat, the Sea Wind, because she was stranded. And they wanted that statement kept out of the boat trial. Now, the question to me would be, was she saying that she had no alternative but to take Mac's boat, the Sea Wind, because she was stranded on Palmyra? Or was she saying they had no alternative but to take Mac's boat, the Sea Wind, because they were stranded once Iola got stuck on a reef on Palmyra or out at sea? So the visiting federal judge denied the motion to suppress the statements and also ruled that the government didn't have to return the yacht to her, but only those items that she could prove belonged to her. It goes on here if you care to stop and read it at your leisure. So January 7th, 1975, Judge King grants the motion. There was a motion to sever the defendants' cases. That's where you try them separately. So both defendants were granted the right to be tried separately. That always goes better for the defendants, and it goes worse for the state, because the state, instead of trying them both at the same time, using the same evidence, same witnesses, same testimony, exactly the same courthouse, you get what I'm saying? Then now all of a sudden you've got two different trials. A witness may get sick, they might be inconsistent, a whole make and manner of things. So it always goes better for the defendants when the trials are severed, and they were tried separately. And Stephanie, through her attorney, entered a not guilty plea to the 4 charges against her. The prosecution contended that the couple, Stephanie and Buck, intended to steal the Sea Wind, and that they deliberately sank their boat, the Iola, in the ocean off the atoll. And to support this theory, they produced photos taken by the defendants, photos of the Sea Wind with red netting around it, the netting that had been on the Iola in case the dogs washed overboard. Okay, so to get something into evidence, the state or the defense has to lay a foundation for the evidence, that it wasn't tampered with, essentially. So in theory, Stephanie and Buck are on the Sea Wind. They're taking photographs. Stephanie has the 35 millimeter photographs, and she gives it to a friend to drop off at the drugstore. Well, then arrests take place. So someone picks up the developed prints and takes it to her at the jail and gives her the photographs. So does that make sense? So let's lay the foundation for this. Elabelle Kama, a matron at the Halawa jail, testified that she had met Larry Siebert, that's one of Stephanie and Buck's friends, when he came to visit Stephanie and took the envelope of photos from him. And back in the day, you dropped off your film at a pharmacy. They would develop the film in 35 millimeter and they would cut it into strips and they would put the film, the negatives, and the printed pictures and put them in an envelope. So she first examined and stated that some nude photos were not allowed and would be placed in the inmate's property. She kept the envelope at the gate and took it to the front office after Siebert's visit, and it got turned over to the FBI. So there's the chain of evidence for the photos. And some of this is from the appellate record. It's just sometimes easier to read that because they sum it up. I want to say that pictures can really tell a story, and in my opinion, that's why they did not want these photographs in evidence. Testimony during the prosecution's case established that the blue and white craft in the photographs is the Iola. The prosecution also introduced evidence showing that the second vessel in the foreground of the fourth photograph is the Sea Wind. The rather distinctive red net visible in the foreground of the picture is the same net that was on the gunwales of the Sea Wind when it returned from Palmyra and dropped anchor in the Honolulu Yacht Harbor. The government contended at trial that all 5 photographs were taken from the Sea Wind while Stearns and Walker were returning to Hawaii. If the jury accepted the government's version, the pictures of the Iola under full sail on the open sea, not far from the Sea Wind, severely damaged, if not destroyed, Stearns' claim that the Iola became stranded while under tow and sank just outside the channel entrance. The crucial photograph is the one showing the blue and white Iola on the open seas with the rigging of the Sea Wind in the foreground. Particularly significant is the red net shown on the Sea Wind in the photograph. And the government, in its case in chief, demonstrated that the Iola was equipped with the red net to prevent Stearns' and Walker's dogs from falling overboard when it was anchored at Palmyra. It could therefore be inferred that Stearns and Walker's used the net for the same purpose on the Iola's voyage from Hawaii. The government established by testimony that the net on the Sea Wind in the foreground of the photograph was the same net that had been on the Iola. And since the evidence presented in the government's case indicated that the Iola and the Sea Wind arrived at Palmyra 4 or 5 days apart, and that their respective crews had no contact until the 2 vessels were moored in the Palmyra harbor, it follows that the Sea Wind could not have been equipped with the Iola's nets until its return voyage to Hawaii. You get it? So any other way you could try to make those pictures happen could not have happened any other way than how the state put it. That's what they found in the appellate court. So the picture showing the red netting on the Sea Wind and its absence on the Iola thus established that the photograph was taken on the return voyage. The photograph with the Sea Wind in the foreground authenticates the other 4 pictures as to time. It is apparent that in all 5 photographs, the cloud and sky conditions are the same, the lighting is the same, the distance between the camera and the Iola is substantially the same, and the color condition of the ocean is the same. So what's the point of this? It proves that both Buck and Stephanie lied when they said that the Iola didn't make it back out to sea, because obviously it did. And that seemingly, it could be argued that they sank her. They sank her, or she was sinking, and they took off on the Sea Wind. Couple that with the fact that the Iola's hatch cover was found on Palmyra, that looks pretty damning, doesn't it? Mac's sister, Mary Graham Munsey, also known as Kit, was the first witness, and she established that the Grahams were experienced sailors. She talked about how her brother was very conservative with money, thrifty, and cautious. He made a dime go a long way, and also that he would not have gambled away the Sea Wind in some kind of a chess game, because seemingly one of the first iterations of the how we came to get the Sea Wind story was that Mac had gambled away the Sea Wind in a chess game, and Buck had won her. So that was one of the first stories told by the defendant. In the opening statement, Eggers said he would prove that the Grahams had called the Allens hippies who constantly beg food because they have no supplies of their own and who own vicious dogs, of which the Grahams said they were terrified. And he also said the meeting of the Grahams and the Allens on Palmyra was a date with destiny, and evidence will show that there was immediate friction between the Grahams and Miss Stearns. He would have probably said the couple, but the trials were severed at this point. So at this point, only Stephanie was the defendant in this case. Various witnesses that had actually been on Palmyra, some of them took the stand, like Edwin Pollock. He testified how he met the parties. He talked about how the Sea Wind was well stocked and that the Iola was leaking. On the stand, he said that the Iola was, quote, was a very poor craft, end quote, and, quote, couldn't be too seaworthy a craft. And seemingly, Stephanie gasped, as though she was surprised, and shook her head from side to side on hearing Pollock's testimony. She reacted similarly when he said she told him that the Iola was leaking very badly and that she had stood in, quote, knee-deep water sometimes. Pollock described the Sea Wind as, quote, probably the most beautiful boat I've been aboard. He said it was jam-packed with food supplies and expensive heirlooms which were of great value to the Grahams. Thomas Wolfe, another witness from Palmyra, testified that Stephanie was, quote, tired of eating coconuts and fish. He talked about Buck shooting a fish with the gun instead of fishing the proper way, and that Graham's Zodiac, that the defendants claimed they found flipped, was sturdy. He also testified the Iola, quote, appeared like a boat that was less than seaworthy condition. I wouldn't sail it from Palmyra in any direction. FBI agent Calvin M. Shishido, who was a member of the Palmyra search party, said they found that lagoon so smooth it would be difficult to tip over a rubber Zodiac dinghy of the type the Grahams had. A government witness also examined the Zodiac's engine and determined that it had not been submerged in salt water. And if this is true, then the Zodiac was not overturned in the manner described. It is my personal opinion also that the engine had not been submerged in water. It's also my personal opinion that the Zodiac was not overturned in the manner described. I also want to clarify that as well. Another witness, Larry Briggs, took the stand. He was one of the first folks that met the Allens, that was Buck and Stephanie. He testified that they had no food or supplies and talked of how they would live off the land with nothing there but coconuts. He talked about how his crew also helped to dislodge their vessel, the Iola, when it caught on the reef when they were first trying to get into the channel. He says, quote, I recognize it as the Old Margaret, an old wooden boat which they'd try to repair with fiberglass. It was barely seaworthy. And Miss Stearns told me it leaked and they had to bail water from it. He said, it looked like a rough boat, and I knew it was so old I was surprised to still see it around. Isn't that crazy how these old salts recognize the old boats, even though it had been fiberglassed over and stuff? And the nuts to think that they could take the Sea Wind and change the name and no one would notice, because it was very distinctive. Briggs also said that Stephanie, quote, begged food from several boats that landed at Palmyra and told me Walker was seasick and that she did most of the work sailing from Maui to Palmyra. He also added that the boat had no engine and could only move under sail, quote, but they had no mainsail and had to use the jib. Pollock also testified as to the conversation when he saw Stephanie and Buck back in Hawaii, and he said, she told me that the day before she and Alan were to leave Palmyra, that Malcolm invited them to dinner. Malcolm supposedly told them that he and his wife were going fishing and will be back late to go aboard and make themselves at home. Now, the Grahams are very warm, very nice people. There are probably 50 people in the harbor here who've met them in various ports of the world and think the world of them. They sailed around the world 5 or 6 years ago. But I don't think Malcolm would invite them to go aboard his boat without him being there. The girl told me they waited, but that the Grahams didn't return. She said they looked for them 3 days, then found their dinghy upside down. So he's kind of saying that he doubted that Mac and Muff would have invited the couple to be on the Sea Wind without them being there. So Stephanie Stearns takes the stand in her own defense, and she tells the story about how they were invited over to dinner by Mac, and that they go aboard the Sea Wind, and that then Mac and Muff are going fishing, and they don't come back, and that the next morning they go looking for Mac and Muff, and she and Buck find the Zodiac overturned. That's the story that she tells at the boat trial. Stephanie, when shown the pictures of the Iola and the Sea Wind under sail together, she denied that the two boats were together under full sail off the atoll, contrary to the pictures, contrary to what one's eyes could see. And in my opinion, just on the galling front, in some of the pictures that were not put into evidence, allegedly there were some sex acts photographed on the Sea Wind of Buck and Stephanie. And that's neither here nor there, but using Mac's camera and tripod. This is in the appellate record, so the prosecution reminded the jury of things the pair did to show that their intent was to steal the boat. He pointed out that the two nameplates of the Sea Wind and a golden figurehead of a woman attached to her were removed. And after the defendants returned to Honolulu, evidence showed that they repainted the blue trim around the Sea Wind's hull a lavender color and registered the boat under the name Lokahi. And Miss Stern denied these things were done to disguise the boat. Stephanie Stearns was convicted after a jury trial on 2 counts of the theft of personal property within special maritime jurisdiction of the U.S. and 1 count of transporting stolen property. So that's 3 counts in total. And note that for the record, since no bodies had been found at this time, no murder charges had been filed at this time. Before passing sentence, the judge heard a last-ditch effort by the defense that included testimony by a PI who said that Stephanie was guilty of, quote, out-and-out gross stupidity. Ms. Stern's attorney, Winston Mirikitani, called her, quote, an average, simple woman in love with a, quote, man on the run. This was in reference to Buck Dwayne Walker, who, as we've mentioned, will be tried in a different trial. Their trials were severed. But meanwhile, the prosecution said that she was not, quote, repentant, remorseful, or apologetic. So Eggers asked for a sentence of 5 years on 1 count of stealing the yacht. Then he sought 2 and 3 years more, respectively, for the remaining counts of theft of money and property. Here's a reaction of when the verdict was read. So this article says, the 28-year-old defendant showed no emotion as she stood before federal judge Samuel P. King and listened to the jury's decision. After the verdicts were read, she fell back on her chair and stared, dry-eyed, as King polled the 8-woman, 4-man jury who had deliberated more than 7 hours after a 4-day trial. Her court-appointed attorney, Winston Mirikitani, told the Advertiser, I will not appeal the conviction. She will later appeal regarding the admission of certain photographs and the foundation of those photographs. And the question before the appellate court was whether the prosecution established sufficient foundation for the admission at trial of an exhibit consisting of 5 photographs. The Ninth Circuit Court heard the appeal and affirmed the earlier conviction. And that's at United States v. Stearns 550 Federal 2nd 1167. That's the Ninth Circuit, 1977. And what gets me is for Stephanie's sentencing, Buck sends an emotional letter to the judge. Y'all are going to find out the Buck's real wordy and stuff, so let's just cut to the chase. He said, Stephanie is not guilty of boat theft nor any of the related charges. I know the jury has rendered a verdict to the contrary. The verdict is wrong. She is guilty at best of having loved me, of having tried to protect me. Stephanie was sentenced to 2 years for count 1 and probation for counts 2 and 3 to run concurrently, and I believe she served about 7 months for her crime. Okay, so this is a painful thing. On June 28, 1975, They say Stearns' pets were auctioned. I believe that the 2 black labs belonged to Buck, and she obviously kept her dog Puffer, but I believe this was Sista Apopolo, was auctioned off for sale from the animal quarantine station. So that's the fate of the pooches. Stephanie kept Puffer, and the 2 black labs were auctioned off. On December 1st, 1974, the trial for Buck was set for the theft of the Seawind. His attorney, David Betancourt, indicated that Walker would pursue the salvage rights to the vessel, just like Stephanie had attempted. And that's the absolute galling thing, right? So, in my opinion, Stephanie's trial was like a trial run for Buck, because he and his attorney would be able to see what worked and what didn't work and to adjust his story accordingly. Both of the defendants' boat theft trials were held on the mainland due to pre-trial publicity. And on December 10th, 1975, the trial for Buck Walker began in front of federal judge Samuel P. King. And Assistant U.S. Attorney William J. Eggers III was the prosecutor, like in Stephanie's trial. So let's jump in with Buck's own words from his book, Palmyra, True Story of an Island Tragedy. The grand jury indictment was impressive. We had been charged with theft of Seawind, interstate transportation of stolen property, to wit, Seawind and all her wares, smuggling marijuana, theft of $400 from Seawind, and illegal possession of firearms, my pistol and rifle. I had 2 extra charges, jumping bail and violation of U.S. passport laws. The marijuana charge puzzled me. It was for 464 grams, over a pound. I knew we hadn't had any such amount aboard, and I wondered if a pound of grass had gone undiscovered by us aboard Seawind. Did Mac and Muff have secret vices? Had they managed to fake us out so completely? It turned out to be a bag of seeds I had somehow overlooked. Side note, he's a scumball. The smuggling, illegal possession of firearms, and bail jumping charges would eventually be dismissed for reasons I'm not sure and cannot remember. It may be that possession of marijuana seeds only was not a crime, and perhaps the prosecution could not prove ownership of the guns since they were not registered to me. The bail jumping charge, which is really a failure to appear as ordered, was probably dismissed on the technicality that it had not actually been ordered to appear on a specific date. There had been some confusion in the court calendar during my appearance to plead guilty. So the trial began in front of Judge King, and many of the witnesses that had testified in Stephanie's trial also took the stand. Many of the old salts that were also present on Palmyra, like Jack Wheeler. Again, the government was contending that Buck and Stephanie stole the Seawind because it was stocked with food and was well equipped, and that the Grahams hadn't been heard from since. It also was brought out that Buck had been convicted of distributing a hallucinogen similar to LSD on Maui, so that was brought out. Donald Stevens, another witness from Palmyra, testified that Buck tried to trade their unworking radio for food, but Stevens declined the offer, and instead he just gave him some flour, a sack of corn flour, and 2 tins of corned beef. He also talked about how after Mac had been on their boat, that Buck would come and get the cigarette butts that Mac had left behind, really painting Buck as a real scavenger of the atoll. 2 different witnesses testified that Buck told them their food supply was low and that the vessel Iola was leaking. Thomas Wolfe, a chemical engineer from San Diego, testified about how he went fishing with Walker and saw him use the .22 pistol to shoot fish, and no fish was caught, and also told the story about how one of Walker's dogs bit him in the stomach, and Walker then told him he was either running low or out of dog food. And also Walker said, I should kill the blank dogs so we could get some steaks here. If that comment doesn't scream desperation, I don't know what does. 2 experts from McWane Marine Supply testified that they could not overturn the Zodiac in heavy surf with 4 people on board, which belied the story that the Grahams had flipped their Zodiac and drowned. One witness, Joseph Stewart, had testified that Buck had told him that he won Seawind in a chess game, but then Mac's sister took the stand and testified that Mac would not gamble the Seawind. Quote, "You better believe not. No way. It was like part of his body," unquote. On December 12th, the friend of Buck, Larry Siebert of Kihei, I think he's also the one that took in the photos to the jail for Stephanie, he took the stand and he told of how one day after Stephanie's arrest, Buck shaved off his full red beard and his mustache, and he said that Buck was, quote, nervous and asked Siebert to check on Stephanie. To summarize, the prosecution had argued to the jury that Buck stole the yacht because he was desperate, and the prosecution also said that Buck's boat, the Iola, was leaking and his food supply was running low. They also argued that Walker revealed criminal intent by sailing the Seawind to Honolulu, repainting it, and using an alias, Roy Allen, when he registered the yacht. In response, attorney Betancourt repeatedly attacked what he said the government's attempt to imply that Walker killed the Grahams and took the yacht. Betancourt said that only Walker and his girlfriend, Stephanie Stearns, were on the island in late August when the Grahams disappeared. Quote, "The only person who was there has testified, and even he does not know what happened," Betancourt said. So Buck is going to take the stand and give 3 hours of testimony. When asked why he purchased the Iola, he said that he wanted to, quote, "sail the 7 seas and flee the drug charges." Asked why he was fleeing, quote, "I felt I was going to be the scapegoat in the matter, and I didn't want to go to jail, so I fled." Walker said that he had worked on the Iola on Maui, sailed it to Honolulu to buy supplies, and then went to Nawiliwili, Kauai. He stayed in Kauai for 2 weeks before leaving for Palmyra. Buck claimed that they had a 4-month supply of food, and he claimed that he was on, quote-unquote, friendly terms with the Grahams, and that they had even invited the couple to dinner, that they had gone fishing, and they never returned. He said, "I never at any time thought of stealing the boat." And also, he adjusts his earlier statement in this trial, and now he says the Iola had hit the reef on the way out of Palmyra, but they managed to free Iola because, honestly, the authorities went and searched Palmyra. If Iola had been stuck back on that reef, they would have found Iola stuck on the reef, and she wasn't. And then in Stephanie's trial, those pictures were shown of Iola out on the blue water with the Seawind and Iola seemingly sinking. So guess what? He tailors his story. He said that he intended to turn the yacht over to Graham's sister on the mainland, although he felt he had a salvage claim to the yacht. So he states that his intention was to return the Seawind. He said they spent 3 days resolving their problems and deciding what to do. He said that Stephanie wanted to use the Seawind to tow the Iola to Fanning Island, but claimed that the Iola got caught on a reef, which damaged it. Buck claimed that he left a note on the sinking Iola, "Finders keepers." Yeah, right. Walker told the court he was going back to Hawaii to face the music on his drug charge, which meant another 5 years in prison, and only removed the Seawind's name plaque because he was a fugitive and wanted to arrange the terms of his arrest. He hadn't figured that out, he said, when Stephanie was arrested. Buck's attorney, Betancourt, argued, "How do you bring a boat in without turning yourself in at the same time?" Oh, God. He also rejected the government contention that Walker was hungry and desperate. He said that Walker and Miss Stearns were willing to eat birds' eggs, fish, and coconuts on Palmyra as part of their lifestyle, not out of desperation for food. In his testimony, Walker said the Grahams disappeared after a fishing trip, and Walker said he had found the Grahams' dinghy floating upside down and, despite a 3-day search, could not find the Grahams. Quote, "The sea swallows up its dead, and that's what happened in this case. We are left to conjecture, speculate, theorize," Betancourt told the jury. "We do not have evidence." Betancourt did ask Walker if he had killed Malcolm Graham, and Walker said, "No, I did not." Note for the record, Judge King did have that exchange stricken from the record because there wasn't supposed to be innuendo of murder, as this was just simply supposed to be a boat theft trial. And now this might be a coincidence, but it's really eerie. On December 14th, while the trial's going on, the sea wind is in evidence at the Sand Island Coast Guard Station. And there was also some evidence or something contained in metal cargo containers, and it was broken into, and the boxes inside were slashed open. So the yacht itself was at the Coast Guard Station, but the gear was stored separately. So there was a break-in during or in the midst of Buck's trial. Again, I don't know if this was a coincidence or what this was. And the gear was the personal items of the Grahams, and I find it a bit odd. On December 15th, the federal court jury found Buck Dwayne Walker guilty, after 6 hours of deliberation, of stealing the Sea Wind. So he was found guilty of the theft of the yacht, the theft of its contents, and for applying for a passport under a false name. But since there was no trace of the Grahams, they were not tried for murder at this point. Stearns got 2 years in prison. I believe she served 7 months, and Walker got 10. Later on, there will be some appeals, and he'll get some of that reduced, but he also had other charges. On December 26, 1975, the Sea Wind was moved back to the tuna packers, so the salvage claims were not found to be viable, and the idea was that the Sea Wind could be sold by Mary Muncie. So, Sea Wind goes back to the tuna packers. And then the sea will tell. The sea swallows up its dead. That was what Betancourt had said. And then the sea told. The sea spat back out its dead. So stay tuned. Stay tuned for part 5 of The Curse of Palmyra. We're going to talk about the bones. If you found this informational, if you liked it, please hit the like button. Please hit the subscribe bell. And do all those YouTube-y things. And without further ado, have an excellent day.